Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar as part of the Global Health and Artificial Intelligence Network in the MENA region webinar series organized by the Global Health Institute at the American University of Beirut under its eSaha Digital Health Program. I would like to introduce you to our esteemed speaker, Ms. Lina Abu Habib. Ms. Lina Abu Habib is the director of the Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship at the American University of Beirut. She also teaches undergrad and grad gender courses at the American University of Beirut, and she is the Gender Project Director for the AUP MEP TLS program. She currently serves on the board of the Urgent Action Fund and is the chair of the Doria Feminist Fund. Ms. Abu Habib is a member of the editorial committee of the Gender and Development journal published by Oxfam. Ms. Lina was previously the executive director of Women's Learning Partnership, and before that, the director of the CRTT.A. She has worked extensively with the Royal Tropical Institute and with several international and regional organizations. She serves as the secretary and then the chair of the board of the Association for Women's Rights and Development, and she has a considerable experience in feminist qualitative research, gender analysis, and training and facilitation. She was a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Applied Humanities, Institute of Public Policy at Auckland University of Technology, and at the Global Health as a global gender consultant. Ms. Abu Habib worked in most countries of the MENA region, in West Africa, and in the Caucasus. Ms. Lina Abu Habib, thank you for joining us in this webinar, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm just realizing that this is such a long bio. I should shorten it from now on. So thank you so much. And it's always a pleasure to engage and to collaborate with the Global Health Institute. And I'm delighted with this series of very, very serious webinars. So thank you again, Nadine. Before we begin, I just want to set the scene in terms of when we start discussing gender and something, gender considerations and something. And it's really important to understand two things. First of all, that it's totally, or if I may say, it's impossible to make the connection and say, what are the gender considerations in this sector or the other, without understanding the key concepts and fundamental terminologies and concepts related to gender. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind, because what we will start with is take a quick but deep dive into, so what is gender and what are the fundamental concepts of gender? Why is it important? Why should we take it into consideration? And this will be our toolbox, if I may say so, our toolbox for looking at any sector. Today, we're going to look at AI. We're going to look at take this toolbox, review it, discuss it, and see, okay, how does it pan out in AI? It will be the same toolbox for you as you think about other sectors, be it health, education, employment, political participation, democracy, etc. So what we're trying to say is that all these really critical, important areas of concern and of intellectual exercise are not neutral. And everything that happens is actually affected by various complex and overlapping gender consideration. And hence, that's why we're starting with this toolbox. The second thing I want you to keep in mind is that this continues to be work in progress. So looking at definitions, looking at key concepts, looking at analytical tools to understand gender is not set in time, far be it from that. If I was having this conversation 5 years ago, there are things which wouldn't have been there. There are definitions which we would have thought or we would have presented in a different way. So this is work in progress as we continue to unpack the meaning of humanity, the meaning of social relations of gender, the meaning of diversity, equality, equity. So please keep these two things in mind. And before, without further ado, we're going to start, and it's going to be a double act between me and Nadine. Nadine, first of all, thank you for this amazing PowerPoint. Could we move to the first slide? Okay. So our first thing is to look at foundational terminologies, foundational definitions. And as I said, this is work in progress. Research is on this is work in progress. Thinking and intellectual exercises around them is actually also work in progress. In the early days, we used to talk about simply sex and gender, and it was, believe me, incredibly difficult to, or let's say at least it was challenging to explain to people what is the difference between sex and gender. And I will be sharing with you here just simple distinction. So we refer to sex as what we are born with, what has been assigned to us when we were born. Okay, so it's by what we have been assigned based on a certain biological category, which in the beginning we used to only represent as male or female. And related to sex as a biological definition is gender. And gender is about what do we do? How do we behave? What roles do we take on? What roles do we take on inside the household and also outside the households? How do we behave? What people expect from us? What does our family expect from us? What do our teachers at school expect from us? What does society expect from us? So, and I'm just going to give an example. So if you were born as a female, okay, you are expected, first of all, to follow some sort of behavioral norms. You're supposed to be nice. You're supposed to be obedient. You're supposed to be to follow instructions. You're supposed to be also a prude. There are certain ways that you can dress, certain ways that you cannot dress. If you are born with a male body organ, you're supposed to be rough, you're supposed to be protective, you're supposed to be playing certain kind of sports, you're supposed to speak in a certain way, you're supposed to have a certain level of confidence. And it doesn't stop here, as you know. It basically, this continues as you grow in terms of expectations and role. How do you behave? How do you relate to other people? What other jobs become male jobs assigned to males? What roles are assigned to males, and what jobs and activities are assigned to females? Next slide, please. And the other thing that another definition that is very important to us, which is what is feminism and why is everybody confused about it? Feminism has existed actually, and it's not imported from the West. Different forms of feminism have always existed. And they have always existed because across the world, from north to south and east to west, there have been oppressive power relations, often based on patriarchal social structures. Yani, male-headed household, older male-headed household, male of a particular category or religion or status or economic power, okay? So feminism is a response. It's a response in the form of political and social movements that aims to basically unpack these social structures that are oppressive on the basis of gender. But feminism is also a tool, an analytical lens to understand what do we mean when we say gendered experiences? What do we mean by when we say gendered discrimination? What do we mean by when we say gendered oppression? And if I may give an example, sexual harassment, whether at work, whether it happens at home, whether it happens in the street, is actually a form of harassment which is often experienced by women and girls because they are women and girls. This is a gendered experience. And because they are expected to be not to be in the public domain, they are expected to be subordinate entities, and men have the power over their bodies. So this is a gendered experience of oppression. Being refused, for instance, a job in a leadership role because you're either a woman or a woman who is pregnant is an experience of discrimination on the basis of gender. So feminism is simply, on the one hand, a political and social movement to challenge these multiple oppressions. That's on the one hand, but also a way to understand the experiences of discrimination and oppression that are gendered, that we all deal with, each one of us. And that's, on the one hand, the simplicity, but also the complexity of understanding gender. This is an experience that each single person have had. The next one. Okay. As I said, we started looking at gender as a binary. What does it mean? Binary comes from two. So basically, we're saying there are only two nicely distinct, opposite, and totally disconnected forms of masculine or feminine. You're either this or the other. In reality, it's a little bit more complicated than this. And we often say now that we have more tools to analyze and to understand that the gender binary is basically a result of statistical laziness, that it's really easy to have people only in these two boxes and it's done. Actually, it's way more complex than this. We talk about gender expression. What does it mean? It means that actually, contrary to what was imposed, meaning that if you're a girl, you have to wear dresses and pink, and you have to have low self-esteem, and you have to have a nice voice, and you have to be obedient. A gender expression means that every single person has the full right to wear whatever clothes, to have any behavior as long as it's not harmful to others, and to appear physically whichever way they want. And you remember that, you know, and until now, actually, it still exists until now, how some people are really even afraid when they see men as a category wearing earrings or wearing jewelry or not conforming with the masculine way of putting on clothes, or even irritated by women wearing masculine clothes. Basically, what we mean by gender expression is that every single person can express themselves with their clothes, with the way they behave, they walk, they talk, and with their overall personal experience. This is part of personal freedom. Gender identity goes also beyond this, and it's not just about how you express yourself, it's also how you identify yourself. And this we're going to explore a little bit more before we're moving. So gender identity means we don't have two neat artificial category. We actually have a spectrum. And people actually decide themselves based on how they feel, based on their belief, based on their expression. They decide where they are on this gender spectrum. And wherever they are, they have the right to have rights. They have the right to education, they have the right to employment, they have the right to healthcare services, they have the right to dignity and to respect. Can we move to the next one? Okay. So that's, again, moving more and exploring more. And then now you're going to see how, you know, all of these concepts are connected. So, and there's a really nice flow in terms of how we build our understanding and how we explore and how we expand our understanding. There are two things that you need to keep in mind when we talk about gender identity. You often hear the term cisgender. Cisgender is when your gender identity is perfectly aligned with the sex in which you were born. So a cis person, a cis man or a cis woman is somebody who is born with the biological equipment of a woman and who considers herself as a woman, vice versa for a man. Transness or transgender is when your identity, your gender identity, does not align with the sex you were born with. Hence, the process of transitioning, which is a process that carries a lot of prejudice, a lot of discrimination, and a lot of oppression. Whether we, or let me say, whatever our ideological position are vis-a-vis thinking about gender as a spectrum and thinking about cisgender people and transgender people, whatever it is not possible to cancel a category of people. People are there. And of course, instead of canceling, what societies and what institutions resort to is actually oppression and isolation and exclusion. But you cannot cancel any category of people. طيب. Gender roles, I think we've covered this. It's what is expected of anybody. And here we're saying actually behaviors, responsibilities are actually the choice that people, the informed choices that people make, rather than what society, what their expects of them. And I think one thing that you need to remember when we talk about this is that luckily gender is changing and changeable. Otherwise, we would not be having this discussion today. So for instance, if you look through time, you look historically, many jobs and professions were not allowed for women, particularly the prestigious professions, the high-paying professions, you know, being a doctor, being a surgeon, being able to litigate in court, etc. This is changing and changeable because on the one hand, it's oppression and discrimination and exclusion has a social and economic cost. And on the other hand, people resist and people fight and people claim their rights. The last one that I want to share with you is the concept of heteronormativity. And this is something where you need to differentiate between what is common and what is natural and normal, okay? What is common is something where the statistics show that this is more common than something else. Fine. What is normal and what is natural, it's not for human beings to decide. It's not for us to decide whether trans is normal or abnormal. It's not for us to decide whether homosexuality is normal or abnormal. But we can say that it is the most common. It's the most common behavior that we see. It doesn't mean that this is the natural behavior. Heteronormativity is, what it means is that heterosexuality and therefore the gender binary is normalized, and it becomes the only form of legitimacy that basically decides on policies, decides on rights, decides on who is included, who is excluded. Nadine, can we move on? Okay. We move to something that is going to be very important for us, which is intersectionality. Intersectionality is a very important and concept, and once we delve into it, we start to see everything in an intersectional lens. The first assumption of intersectionality is that ourselves, each one of us, is actually a combination of different identities. We have our gender identity. We have our social and economic class identity. In Lebanon, we have, for instance, our sectarian identity. We have our legal status, which is an identity. Our nationality is an identity. The fact that we are nationals or refugees is is another identity. The fact that we are able-bodied or disabled is another identity. And what intersectionality means is that we are a combination of all, of course, I'm sorry, I forgot something important. Age is also a part of our identity. Our experiences are part of our identity. So what intersectionality says, it's very simple, as I said, and very important. Through looking through an intersectional lens, what we're saying is that any lived experience that we have is affected by how all these identities intersect together and play out together. I give you an experience. I give you an example. One of the main things that when looking at gender that we want to explore, I'm sorry, a very good example that we usually say to challenge the fact that all women are the same is, let's look at a well-to-do woman in a household who doesn't work and her maid from Sri Lanka. Are they the same? Do they have the same priorities? Do they have the same feelings? Do they experience the same thing? Do they have, if they are sick, do they have similar access to healthcare or to quality healthcare? And then we have to see that actually not at all. Taking one identity, which is being a woman, doesn't make people the same. Race, it actually is a factor for the migrant worker. Social and economic class is another fact. Her legal status as somebody who is bound to her employer by a kafala system increases her vulnerability. And so therefore, how she experiences the same context where she lives with her employer who is a woman is completely different. That is a perfect example of intersectionality. Another example, do I, as a woman who has a job, who is Lebanese, I have I have legal status in Lebanon. Do I experience the same thing as a refugee woman from Syria in Lebanon who is pregnant and who has an abusive husband? Of course not. So for me to be able to understand the lived experience of another person, I have to understand all the aspects of their identity. And this is what we call intersectionality. And so this moves us to, going more in depth into the definition. So how do all these social categories that all of us carry, and I hope that as I'm saying this, we each think of ourselves, how do they connect together? How do they interact together? And how do they affect us vis-a-vis the structures of powers that we deal with? How do they affect us when we deal with governments, or when we deal with our institutions where we work, or when we deal with the law, or when we deal with an oppressive incident on the streets? So there is no way to understand anything or anybody unless we really reconstruct what are the different identities at play, which identity gives more rights and more entitlement to somebody, and which ones actually push them back. So in a way, it's a recognition of inequality. Intersectionality is a recognition of inequality of various structures of power, and how to understand, how do these power relations shape these inequalities. So it's not my identity that is wrong. It's actually the ways in which the other side deals with my identity. It's how the other side oppresses me because of my identity. Can we move on, Nadine? Okay, let's move beyond this because I think I'm taking a little bit of time. Yeah, okay. Now let's drop this also. Okay, طيب. So what I've shared with you is really what we call the foundational concept of gender. And if you're asking yourself, so why is this important? What is important? What benefits do we get from understanding these foundational concepts? Can I ask you, Nadine? Okay. Yeah. So basically, if I want to put it really bluntly, there's no way we can do our work without a proper understanding of gender concepts, particularly in our line of work, all of us, okay? First of all, we're doing what we're doing, all of us, because there are inequalities, because our communities, our societies are uneven, because some have a lot, some have a little bit, and some have nothing. And this is not because people are lazy or people are not lucky. This is because there are structures of inequalities that reproduce themselves. So understanding inequality and how it works allows us to understand what would be the entry point that we need to address gender balances, to basically make sure that people have similar access, similar rights, similar entitlements, and are able to access these. So let me give you an example. I don't know if we have let me give you an example from a simple sector. Let's look at education. And in one country of the region, there was a recognition that there's very, very low literacy rate among girls in certain rural areas. I don't want to go through what country it is. But after years of studies and research and so on, simply the idea that there were no schools for girls that are near their homes with women teachers and bathroom for girls and the safe way to go there meant that girls would not go to school and the illiteracy rate would be almost 100%. So this realization is basically puts us in a place where we think actually having a school somewhere doesn't sort or doesn't address the problem of access to education. There is a gender imbalance because boys have more access to school because on the one hand, there's a preferential treatment, particularly in places where there are limited resources. Secondly, there's a fear for girls for their safety and security if they go out and transportation is not secured. Thirdly, it's quasi impossible, or it was at least at this point in time, which was the early 90s, impossible to accept that girls will be in a classroom with a guy being a teacher. So all of this is important, our understanding of inequalities. What is the inequality between boys and girls in the same age? What kind of inequalities are at play so that they can't go to school, they can't access the right to education in the same way? Secondly, it's actually so that we engage better in what we do, which is actually understanding and implementing social justice. How do we get to justice if we don't understand inequalities and if we don't understand where the problem lies? So, for instance, gender-based violence is a serious problem, and we only started to have solutions for gender-based violence when we realized that this is not an individual issue. This is not, again, somebody who is not lucky, who got a very angry husband. This is a structural issue. This is a lack of recognition that women are more vulnerable in their households than men. This is a lack of recognition that women are not properties and therefore they cannot be beaten. So this understanding leads us to a better engagement in social justice. And I want to give you an example here, and it's also from Lebanon. A couple of weeks ago, or even less, the story is not important, but but it was on social media and it went viral. But there was a man hitting a woman on a street in Lebanon, and you could hear people on the street, because some people were trying to stop him, and some others were saying, "This is his wife. This is his wife." You know. So basically, when people think it's okay to beat her, this is his wife, then we don't have a justice system. We don't have the justice system that looks at the rights and the safety and security of everybody in an equal way. Right. The third thing is, it's, at least for me, it's very important to understand how identities are complex. People are not just men or women. People are all sorts of things. And we cannot, at least in our sector, particularly in the health sector, or in education, or in higher education, or in political participation, we cannot have any impact to improve things if we're not aware of the complexity of identity. If we're not aware, for instance, of the importance of the difference between people with disability, and they're not all just the same because they have the same disability, there is no way that we can engage meaningfully, which leads me to my last point of engagement, which is around policy development. At the end of the day, we're all pushing for inclusive policies that work. Work in which way? They work in terms of addressing gender equality, in being inclusive for LGBTQI rights, in terms of being aware and sensitive to different forms of oppression. So I'll give you an example. If we're saying, let's take the world of work and employment. If I'm saying, if I acknowledge that women are discriminated against and they have a different career path in work because of their care work, okay, I'm doing one of two things: either ignoring care work and saying, as an employer, this is not my problem, or saying, actually, this is part of life, and I'm taking an intentional decision to have pro-care, pro-reproduction employment policies where women's work is safe as they do their reproductive work. If I'm saying, for instance, women of a certain age have an issue in terms of employment continuity because they are subjected to sexual harassment, then if I recognize this, then the next step in policy development is anti-sexual harassment policies at work. The next one, Nadine. Okay. I want to go very briefly in terms of why this is important for us. Gender knowledge is intimately linked with understanding influences on health, influences on access to healthcare. How do people, whatever is their gender, how do they experience illness, and how do they experience healthcare? You might know, for example, that many health facilities would refuse to treat people who are trans or people who are LGBTQ. Other health facilities will refuse to give abortion, even within the framework of what is approved by the law. Actually, understanding gender and gender relation and gender oppression is the first condition for improving health and healthcare, for improving economic impact, because as you address, as I said, for instance, employment patterns, gender wage gap, the presence or absence of economic opportunities, you actually improve economic impact and economic well-being, as well as cultural dynamics, social dynamic, because at the end of the day, as we address social gender norms, as we understand how gender is constructed, as we become more familiar and more comfortable, communities tend to thrive. And similarly in terms of family dynamics, because as you know, the household, and we have this and we have the data, the household is a site of, often a site of violence, of unchecked violence, different forms of violence, but it's also the site where care work is unequally distributed. And if we want to change this dynamic, we need to start by understanding it, and understanding these foundational concepts allow us to understand what family dynamics are constituted of and how do we address them. Can we move on, Nadine? I'm going to pass on this one. Okay. I just want to go very quickly on where does about gender knowledge in our region, in the MENA region. Okay. And why is it important? We've tried here to look at all the different aspects where gender knowledge is important. I want to take media representation, for instance, and I think our media representation is a disaster in the region. Out of curiosity, I try to follow some of the mainstream channels, but also the alternative media on social media and so on. And I think, if you know, except for very few gender aware and gender sensitive media outlets, everything that we have spoken about, you know, social norms of gender, gender stereotypes, patriarchal aspects, etc., are reproduced day in, day out through most of our media outlets. And you know, this is not only about gender, this is also about racism. When media outlet actually reproduce images and ideologies of racism, they're incredibly effective. So that is one aspect where gender knowledge is very important in the MENA region. Another example is legal and policy reform. And I have to say that the region has been very slow. I mean, there have been some breaches or some successes in legal reforms towards gender equality, but these have been like baby steps and very limited. And recently, there has been a mounting anti-rights movement in the region, and not only this, most of the policy reforms towards gender equality are actually now put in question. For instance, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Libya, and in Tunisia even. Tunisia, which had one of the best indicators historically, the word gender is not allowed to be used anymore. So so that's something to take into consideration. So and I want you maybe on your own to look at each of these sectors that we've identified and see, you know, why should we think about gender in conflict and post-conflict? We have a literature. We know about conflict-related sexual violence. We know about the burden of care that women take on. We know how queer folks are actually targeted during conflict and post-conflict. We know about the vulnerability of women-headed households, etc., etc. Each one of these has a very strong gendered implication and actually a huge gap in the region in terms of gender knowledge. Can we move on, Nadine? Okay, I'm not going to, I want to go straight to the AI. Okay. Okay. لا لا بعدها. Okay. طيب. So basically what we've, I didn't cover everything, but there's a detailed paper that you can read later on. I want you to think about everything that I discussed again as your toolbox, as something to think about when you're looking at the situation. What kind of questions do I ask myself? And so next time, for instance, there's there's a picture of the new cabinet that was nominated, or the new parliament that was that was elected. We really need to think about, for instance, why is there no women in the cabinet? Is there no competent women? We know that's not true. And we know also that not all men in a cabinet are competent. In fact, most of them are incompetent. Why? Because there is a reason, and there is a process, and there are social gender norms, and there's a patriarchal system, etc. Why are all our most of our policies anti-LGBTQI? Well, because the patriarchal system only recognizes the gender binary and does all its best to actually cancel and invisibilize and also oppress anything that does not fit into pink and blue. So nothing is a coincidence, and that's why we need this toolbox to think about it. Now, okay, we come to artificial intelligence. And the first thing we need to think about is there it's actually a false question. Is there a gender bias in AI? And before answering this, I need to say that there's nothing, absolutely nothing, where there isn't a gender bias, because when something is being conceptualized, created, etc., it's created around what is considered to be the norm, what is normal. And I remember a student in mechanical engineering that I had, with whom we were having this discussion, who told me after one of the classes, he said he realized that something which for him seemed so neutral is actually gender bias. And it was for him the fact that cars are designed taking into consideration certain bodily specificities, which were basically male bodies of a certain type. So there is nothing that is neutral, and inclusivity does not come on its own. It's something that comes after deep thinking, deep analysis, but also investments. Like, I have to say that I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, and I really looked, I mean, I've been looking up a number of things, but also trying out, I find it a really interesting game to see how does ChatGPT answer different questions. And I can say that what we've been talking about is being introduced and is being used to correct the input of information, and therefore the output that you get from something like ChatGPT. So what do we mean by gender bias in AI? So basically, the simplest definition is that artificial intelligence mirrors or reproduces or exhibits the same gender prejudices and stereotypes that we face in, real physical life. Okay, so how does it manifest itself? By giving various biased data, by giving discriminatory outcomes. Can we move on, Nadine? Okay. So for instance, and that was something that was mentioned in a number of research on biases, it's the fact that who's feeding the information? What is the sources of the historical data? And most of our remember that gender studies and gender as a science, as a social science, is only something that started to develop in the 70s as a science, as research, as writing. And even then, if we look at the earlier researchers and scholars, we were not there yet in terms of inclusive approach, in terms of understanding intersectionality, in terms of challenging the binary. So the input is actually an input that comes from existing historical societal biases and societal stereotype. What does it mean actually? And again, I have to tell you that I'm not a techie. I'm approaching this from a perspective of a gender analysis. It means that these, what we're calling the algorithms, they are unintentionally, and I don't know, maybe intentionally, but let's say it's unintentionally, they are unintentionally fed with, during their designs, they are fed the ideologies, the gendered ideologies, and the perspective and the assumptions of the developers. And I want to give you a parallel here. You know, when we're told, let's go back in history and talk about legal framework and how legal frameworks are designed, and the amazing human effort that throughout the globe, and all these amazing minds that went into into creating or co-creating what we know as the law, the legal system, the legal framework. And then the law is above everything, and it's above all, and it's supposed to be fair, and it's supposed to not discriminate, etc., etc. In most of our countries in the MENA region, we have laws that allow what we call, and I know it's an oxymoron, honor crimes, where men get no are not punished or are hardly punished for killing any woman who's a member of their extended families over a suspicion of dishonoring the family. Okay, it's legal. It is legal because the legislators, that's how they frame honor. Honor is linked to the virginity of all the women and girls' family members. And therefore, they have legislated, and in many of our countries, it still exists until 2024, they have legislated on the basis of family honor equal women's virginity. If women sully the family honor, they can be killed as we try and save this honor. So when I say actually the input in the design phase comes from the developer's perspective and assumption, think about our legal frameworks. And think about how something as supreme and as high level as the law is simply informed by the perspectives and the assumptions and the prejudices of legislators. What does it, why? And if we ask the question why, data seems to say, but again, it is changing as we speak, that the process and those who are involved in the process of AI development, there seems to be a lack of diversity, a lack of gender knowledge, a lack of understanding of what is diversity, what is inclusion, what is gender equality. And again, whether it's in AI, whether it's in looking at the law, or whether it's in looking at the economy, this comes at the end of the day from existing prejudice and gendered ideologies of those who are actually doing the creation and the design. Nadine, can we move on? And again, when I was thinking and trying to research this, I was stunned by how fast things are changing, which in actually it's changing, I have to say, in AI faster than trends have changed in the health sector or in the education sector or in the employment sector. So the earlier literature on this seems to say that the language that is generated, okay, remains gendered. So referring to a doctor, it's a male. Referring to a nurse is a female. And that's why what we call reinforcing societal gendered stereotypes. So this is where it shows us that things cannot be neutral or inclusive automatically just because they have to. There's an effort in changing the way we're designing. And that effort needs to include the language that we're using, the language that we're feeding this system. There are also examples of when AI is requested to or is used as a recruiting tool. Here again, it seems to reproduce and it seems to favor male profile because it's been fed historical hiring data that is actually where certain jobs in the tech industry, in the banking system, etc., particularly at the leadership position, are male dominated. And I know that most of us use AI recruitment tools. We need to be aware that it might be reproducing the same recruitment ideologies that it has been fed. Another gendered bias is in relation to also racial bias, and that's, I think, is incredibly worrying at this date and age, to actually have AI reproducing the same sexist/racist discrimination between women and men, and also in relation to brown skin or light skin. Can we move on? Okay. So basically, when all of this happens, we are reinforcing stereotypes, or let me say that AI has or carries the possibility of reproducing and reinforcing gender stereotypes. It has the capacity of carrying and reproducing exclusion and marginalization that we see around us, which means that there are serious ethical concerns from these reproduction. I think there was a couple of examples in terms of road safety and in terms of the judgment made on whose safety is important or who is likely to be in a certain place. And this is where, colleagues, we cannot underestimate the importance of understanding where is this coming from. This is not the machine that is bad or whatever it is. It's the information that comes from particular people through a certain, looking through a historicity of data and information, which is gendered. And without recognizing this, it's impossible to change it. Can we move on? Okay. So, and I think, once we understand this, what do we do about it? It becomes really simple. So we go back to the essential issue of diversity. Diverse data to be fed into the whole system rather than one particular aspect. Critical gender disaggregated data. A transparency around who is doing this, who is feeding the information, what ideologies are being reproduced, and also our ability to detect any bias and to address it. And at the end of the day, and it's the same if you're talking about education or transportation. In the recent past, we used to talk about gender and IT before gender and NI. We look at the same solution, which is the diversity in the development. So those who are at the table developing the systems, they ought to be diverse. Can we continue? Okay. Which means, on the one hand, doing what we've been doing now, which is education and awareness and having a conversation, that's very important. But what is equally important is what regulatory framework. You know, in countries that have adopted a gendered budgeting law, and in this region, I think Morocco has a gender budget. It means that they have a law that it clearly asks the Ministry of Finance to justify how each item in the budget is going to contribute to addressing which form of gender inequality. So if the Ministry of Education requests a certain budget in its, in the annual budget, it has to justify, according to this law, it has to justify in which way this money is going to be used to address gender inequality, and what is the gender inequality that it's trying to address. Is it high turnover of girls in a certain level? Then what is the reason and how it's going to be addressed? Is it child marriage, increasing child marriage? Then why? Where is it coming from? And how will the budget address it? So these are the kinds of regulatory framework that would actually mitigate gender biases in AI. Can we move? Okay. Can we move to the next one? Okay, so I want to stop here because I think I spoke a lot for an hour, just by saying the process that we talked about, understanding gender. Why do we understand it? What are the benefits? But also, what are the challenges if we don't? And then all this, how do we think about it in? Now it's in AI, we might be looking at at another sector, is really the same process. And if you look at the solutions, they have not been invented. Diversity, regulatory framework, awareness raising, engaging with people and with entities who know about gender inequality and gender equality. These have always been of course, the way you use them are different, but this has always been the path towards actually taking a sector and think about it in terms of, okay, how will it address gender? How will it not address is a little bit soft. How will it challenge gender inequality, and how will it bridge the gender gap? Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Ms. Gina, for this valuable and eye-opening presentation. Now we open the floor for the Q&As. We will be allocating 5 minutes for that. So if anyone has any question, please drop it down in the chat box and we'll be more than happy to address it.
I think I was very clear. There are no questions. Can I suggest something to people as a kind of a...
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Two things. I think for those of you who have a project with GHI, and I would suggest it to you, Nadine, I think it would be important or interesting even just to review it again and decide on 1 or 2 things that you're going to do differently or add, so that this project is, on the one hand, recognizes potential gender biases, and secondly, does something about it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this recommendation. I see no question in the chat box. I see no question. Thank you, Ms. Tina Abu Habib, for this valuable presentation.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Nadine.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.